Hi, Reverend Dan here, and welcome to my Sunday Reflections. In Luke's Gospel, after Jesus' resurrection, we find the story of Cleopas and his travelling companion on the road to Emmaus. I shared a bit of a reflection on that passage on my blog last week. Cleopas and his companion are filled with grief and uncertainty at Jesus' death. And then, as they're journeying to Emmaus, a stranger joins them on their journey. And they hadn't a clue who this stranger was.
As they came near the village to which they were going, the stranger walked ahead as if he were going on. But they urged him strongly, saying, "Stay with us, because it is almost evening, and the day is now nearly over." So he went in to stay with them. When he was at the table with them, he took bread, blessed and broke it, and gave it to them. Then their eyes were opened, and they recognized him, and he vanished from their sight.
What I have found striking reading this over the last week is that it is in the breaking and sharing of bread that the true identity of Jesus is realised. As they sit together in fellowship with one another, learning, discerning, questioning, eating and drinking, the bread is broken and Jesus is seen for who he is. Breaking bread is one of the many titles in Christian tradition that we use for communion, Eucharist, the Lord's Supper. And this week, this story on the road to Emmaus has set me thinking about communion.
This is my home communion set. It was given to me by my placement church while I was training, a multicultural congregation in a deprived and diverse suburb of Birmingham. This reminds me of where I've come from and how I'm part of the national and global church. I use this set to take communion to people who are housebound, so it reminds me both of the local churches to which I serve, but also of the homes to which I have visited and shared communion. This set itself reminds me that the presence of God is everywhere, global, national, local, and in our homes.
Communion is something that may well be important to us in our spirituality as both individuals and as worshipping community. It's a meal that we share, through which we remember Jesus, who shared a meal with his friends before he was arrested and crucified. We take bread and wine as symbols of the body and blood of Christ. We bless them, we break them, and we share them as we remember Christ and experience him present with us now. It's a moment when we are embraced by the unconditional love and unending grace of God that is offered to us through Christ and made present to us by God's Spirit.
But for the moment, the plate and cup are empty. We're not sharing communion together. We are distanced from one another, unable to physically gather and share as a worshipping community.
At the moment, some churches are practicing communion online, but as British Methodists, we are not. In 2018, our Methodist conference considered virtual communion, albeit under very different circumstances to those that we find ourselves in today. But conference discussed it and voted against the practice. And while given current circumstances, I suspect the conversation, at least, would be very different. For now, we have to follow those decisions. We have to leave the plate and cup empty, waiting for the day they can be filled again. And for me, I want to be honest with you and say I've come to a point where I'm okay with that. Yes, it's painful. It's painful not being able to share communion with those of you I know would dearly wish to receive it. It's painful not to be able to gather at the table to share as a worshipping community. Some of you may share my feeling of being okay, but I expect for some of you, not receiving communion has been, or is continuing to be, difficult right now. I want you to know I understand something of that struggle, but I also want to share with you a little bit about why, for me, I've come to a place where I feel okay for the moment, that the glasses and the plate and the cup are empty and waiting, as I and we patiently wait for the time they can be filled again. And in sharing, I hope that it might help you too. At the beginning of this year, many Methodists prayed the Covenant Prayer, a sign and a renewing of our continuing commitment to living in relationship with God, knowing that God continues to be unconditionally committed to us by his love and his grace.
Within the covenant prayer, we say the words, "Let me be full, let me be empty." I've found reflecting on those words in light of not receiving communion during this time very helpful. The covenant prayer contrasts various ways of living, employed or laid aside, having all things or nothing, being full or being empty. But whether employed or laid aside, having all things or nothing, full or empty, all are included as part of our living in relationship with God. There is never an absence of God.
For me, those words remind me that whether I've received communion or not, all of life is saturated in God. That God is still present and part of my life and my being. So this week, I felt God helping me to see this time not as a time where communion's being taken away from me, but a time where I consciously abstain as part of my being emptied for God. Yet at the same time, I also see the empty plate and the empty cup as being just as presence filled by God's Spirit as when they are filled with bread and wine. For me, another reason that I feel okay that we leave the plate and cup empty is that if we did do communion, what about those who are offline? What about those who don't have internet access? Before lockdown, when communion was celebrated in our buildings, there was inclusive intent within our liturgies and our practice, and those who were housebound had the option of receiving home or extended communion. But today, those who would be excluded from online communion have no other way of receiving. As part of our communion, we often share the peace and sometimes prelude it with these words.
In the one Spirit, we were all baptized into one body. Let us therefore keep the unity of Spirit in the bond of peace.
If I was able to offer communion with some of you, I wonder if I would then risk breaking the unity of the Spirit and bond of peace through depriving and excluding some from what I was offering to others. To bring us back to the Emmaus story, as Cleopas and his companion offered hospitality to a stranger, it was in the distribution, the breaking and sharing that Jesus was made known. This Emmaus encounter is not communion as we may have come to practice it. Here is a simple meal and a household who share hospitality with a stranger. But in that act of sharing what they had, their guest shares with them everything he is. We can only gather as households right now. But I can assure you that even though the plate and cup are empty, Jesus is present with us not as a stranger, but as a friend, longing to be a guest at our tables. It may not be how we're used to it through communion. We still patiently wait for the time where we can once again physically gather together and worship and break bread together. But even while cup and plate are empty, if we allow our eyes to be opened to it, God's Spirit, the very presence of God, continues to bind us together. Though distanced, we are united, one in spirit. God's unconditional love and unending grace are overflowing for us as much as they ever have. And whether we feel full or empty, Christ in his fullness is forever with us. May the peace of the risen Christ be with you.